The night my daughter-in-law decided to laugh at me in front of my son's entire company. She believed she was exposing a helpless old woman who didn't belong in her polished world. But what she didn't realize was that every person in that ballroom was about to learn a truth she had never bothered to ask about. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, and until that evening I had spent most of my life happily standing in the background while my family shined. My late husband used to say I was the quiet foundation of our home, the one who made sure the lights stayed on and the bills stayed paid even during the years when money was tight. After he passed away 12 years ago, my son Daniel became the center of my world. I watched him grow from a determined young man with big ideas into the CEO of a technology company that now occupied 3 floors of a glass building in downtown Chicago. When the invitation arrived for the company's annual awards ceremony, printed on thick ivory paper with elegant gold lettering, I held it in my hands for a long time before deciding whether I should go. It wasn't that I wasn't proud of Daniel. I was proud beyond words. But over the past few years, ever since he married Claire, I had begun to feel like a visitor in my own family. Claire Whitmore was 34, polished, confident, and always dressed like she was stepping into a magazine photo shoot. She spoke easily about venture capital, brand strategy, and networking events that lasted until midnight in restaurants where a single steak cost more than my weekly grocery bill. Whenever I visited Daniel and Claire at their house in the suburbs, I felt as if I had stepped into a different world, one where everything was spotless, modern, and carefully curated. Claire always greeted me with a perfect smile that never quite reached her eyes, and while her words were always technically polite, there was often a faint edge underneath them, like a thin layer of frost on glass. Still, Daniel was excited about the ceremony, and he had personally called to tell me it would mean a lot if I were there. "Mom, it's a big night," he said over the phone. "The board will be there, investors, partners, everyone who helped build the company." I told him of course I would come. That Friday evening, I put on the navy blue dress I saved for special occasions and the pearl necklace my husband had given me on our 25th anniversary. The ballroom at the hotel downtown was larger than I expected, filled with round tables draped in white cloth and sparkling with glassware that reflected the warm light from enormous chandeliers. People in tailored suits and elegant gowns mingled with drinks in their hands, their conversations floating through the room like soft music. For a moment, I stood near the entrance, wondering if anyone would notice an older woman standing alone. Then I saw Daniel across the room, tall and confident in a dark suit, talking with a group of investors. And beside him, with one hand resting lightly on his arm and a dazzling smile for everyone who passed by, stood Claire. When she finally noticed me walking toward them, her smile widened just a little too brightly, and something in my chest told me that before the night was over, that smile would reveal far more than she intended. I slowly made my way to the table where my name card had been placed, near the back of the ballroom, but still with a clear view of the stage. The room had grown even louder now that most of the guests had arrived. Conversations overlapped like waves, mixed with the gentle clink of silverware and the soft music drifting from a piano near the corner of the hall. From where I sat, I could see Daniel moving from table to table, greeting partners and shaking hands with people who looked very important. Every few minutes someone would clap him on the shoulder or lean in close to congratulate him. Watching him stand there so confident and composed filled me with a quiet pride that warmed my chest. I remembered the nights when that same young man had stayed up past midnight at our old kitchen table with a laptop that hummed loudly and a stack of notebooks filled with ideas. Back then our house had been small, just a modest place with creaky wooden floors and a dining room window that rattled every winter when the wind came off Lake Michigan. Daniel would sit there in a worn sweatshirt, explaining his plans to me while I poured him fresh coffee. He spoke about building software that would help companies organize their operations more efficiently, though in those days most people barely understood what he meant. I had listened anyway, nodding even when the technical details flew over my head, because what mattered was the determination in his voice. As I looked around the grand ballroom now, I could not help comparing it to those earlier years. Crystal chandeliers hung high above the tables, casting warm light across polished marble floors. Waiters moved quietly between guests carrying trays of elegant appetizers that looked almost too beautiful to eat. At the center of it all stood the large stage where the awards ceremony would soon begin, framed by enormous screens displaying the company logo. Claire appeared near the front of the room again, standing beside a tall man in a charcoal gray suit, who looked like he might be one of the investors Daniel had mentioned. Her posture was flawless, her smile bright as she spoke with animated confidence, occasionally gesturing toward Daniel across the room. Even from a distance I could tell she was comfortable here in a way I never quite would be. A few minutes later she approached my table with two guests following behind her. "Margaret, I would like you to meet a few people," she said with that polished tone that always sounded pleasant but slightly distant. The man beside her introduced himself as Robert Langley, a venture partner from New York, and the woman with him worked for a consulting firm that helped companies expand internationally. They shook my hand politely and asked how long I had lived in Chicago. I told them I had spent most of my life there, raising my son after my husband passed away. Claire listened with an expression that looked almost patient before she gave a small laugh and said lightly, "Margaret prefers a quiet life. All of this business talk is probably a bit much for her." Robert smiled politely, though I noticed a flicker of curiosity cross his face as he glanced at me again. I simply returned the smile and folded my hands in my lap. Claire continued speaking about market growth and corporate partnerships as if I had faded into the background, and in that moment I realized something very clear. In her mind, I was not part of the story of Daniel's success. I was only the elderly mother who showed up for special occasions and politely watched from the sidelines. What she did not know, what she had never once stopped to ask, was that long before the investors, the board meetings, and the elegant ceremonies, there had been one person who believed in Daniel's dream enough to risk everything she had to help him begin. The conversations around the ballroom continued to grow louder as the evening moved closer to the official program, and I could feel the energy of the room shifting from casual greetings to quiet anticipation. Waiters began placing small plates of food on the tables, and the soft music from the piano slowly faded as a few staff members near the stage adjusted microphones and checked the large screens behind the podium. At my table, Robert Langley and the consultant named Amanda continued speaking about international markets and technology investments, topics that sounded impressive but far removed from the quiet life Claire had just described for me. I listened politely, occasionally nodding, though my attention kept drifting across the room toward Daniel. He had finally returned to Claire's side, and the two of them were now standing with a small group of guests that included several executives from his company. Claire noticed me watching and lifted her glass slightly in my direction, the gesture friendly enough that anyone observing might think we shared a warm relationship. A moment later, she said something to the group beside her, and they all turned to look toward my table. Their expressions were curious but not unfriendly, so when Claire motioned for me to come join them, I stood and walked across the room. The polished marble floor reflected the warm lights above us as I approached, and Daniel greeted me with a proud smile. "Mom, I want you to meet a few of the people who helped us expand last year," he said. He introduced me to a man from Boston who worked with their finance team and another woman who managed one of the company's new divisions in Seattle. They all shook my hand with polite interest, and for a few minutes the conversation remained comfortable. Then one of the executives asked how long Daniel had been interested in technology. Before I could answer, Claire laughed lightly and placed her hand on Daniel's arm. "Oh, Daniel has always been ambitious," she said, her voice bright enough for several nearby guests to hear. But I doubt Margaret understood much about his work back then. She comes from a very simple background. The group chuckled politely, assuming the comment was harmless, but Claire continued speaking before anyone could change the subject. "In fact," she added with a playful smile, "when Daniel first started his company, he was basically working out of his mother's dining room. I always imagine her sitting there wondering what on earth he was doing with all those wires and computer screens." A few people laughed a little louder this time, and someone joked that many great companies begin in unusual places. Claire nodded enthusiastically, but then tilted her head slightly toward me, as if sharing a humorous secret. "To be fair," she said, "Margaret has always preferred a quiet life. Business strategies and investor meetings are probably not her world." The words were delivered so smoothly that it took a second for the meaning behind them to settle into the air. I noticed a couple of the executives glance at me with polite smiles that carried a hint of sympathy, the kind people offer when they assume someone feels out of place. Daniel shifted his weight beside Claire, his expression uncertain for just a moment. But before he could say anything, another guest joined the circle, and the conversation moved on. Claire's smile never faltered as she greeted the newcomer and launched into another discussion about the company's growth. I stood there listening quietly, aware that to everyone around us the exchange had probably sounded like harmless humor. But as I looked at Claire speaking so confidently about Daniel's success, one thought returned to me with perfect clarity. She believed she understood every chapter of this story, yet she had never asked who helped write the first one. The memory of that night stayed with me as the applause in the ballroom slowly faded and the host continued speaking about the company's growth. My fingers rested quietly on the edge of the table while I watched the stage, but in my mind I was back in that small kitchen more than 10 years earlier. Daniel had looked so young then, his shoulders tense as he explained that starting the company would require far more than hard work. He needed funding, real funding, enough to build the first version of his software and keep the lights on long enough to prove that his idea could work. I remember the way he kept apologizing while he spoke, as if he already expected the answer to be no. When I returned to the kitchen table with the small metal box in my hands, he stared at it in confusion. Inside were the savings your father and I had spent a lifetime building. It was money meant for retirement, for security, for the quiet years that people hope to enjoy after working hard their entire lives. I placed the box on the table and told Daniel to open it. Realized was that the real beginning had happened long before that office ever existed. In a quiet kitchen where a mother chose to trust her son's future more than her own security. And as the applause rose once more around the ballroom, I had a feeling that before this evening ended, that forgotten beginning might finally find its way back into the story. A moment before continuing in a slower voice, he explained that while many people knew about the early office and the late nights Daniel spent building the first version of his software, there was another part of the story that had never been fully shared at company events.